There's a moment in most people's financial lives when they realize something doesn't quite add up. You've been saving consistently, making responsible choices, avoiding debt, doing everything the personal finance books tell you to do. And yet the progress feels painfully slow. Meanwhile, you notice that people who already have money seem to accumulate more of it with less visible effort. The common explanation is that wealthy people simply know something you don't, or that they're more disciplined, or that they have access to better investment opportunities. But what if the real answer has less to do with knowledge or behavior, and more to do with how financial systems are structurally designed to reward existing capital? The common belief. The prevailing narrative around wealth building is fundamentally behavioral. We're told that anyone can build wealth through discipline, consistency, and smart decision-making. Save a portion of your income. Invest in diversified assets. Avoid lifestyle inflation. Compound interest will do the rest. This framework treats wealth accumulation as a linear process. Put in the effort, follow the rules, and you'll get proportional results over time. This belief persists because it contains elements of truth. Discipline does matter. Consistency does produce results. People who save nothing will obviously accumulate less than people who save something. The advice isn't wrong exactly. It's just incomplete. It focuses entirely on individual behavior while ignoring the structural architecture that determines how quickly that behavior translates into actual wealth. The behavioral model also appeals to our sense of fairness. If wealth building is purely a function of personal choices, then outcomes reflect merit. People who struggle financially must be making poor decisions. People who thrive must be making good ones. This framework is psychologically comfortable because it suggests control. If you just make the right choices, you'll get the right results. But this model breaks down when you examine how capital itself functions within the economic system. The issue isn't that behavior doesn't matter. It's that behavior operates within a structure that amplifies or dampens its effects, depending on how much capital you already possess. How the system actually works. The key structural force at work here is what economists call the marginal productivity of capital. In simple terms, the more capital you have, the more income that capital can generate, independent of your labor. This isn't about secret investment strategies or exclusive opportunities. It's about the basic mathematics of returns applied to different scales of capital. When you invest $1,000 at a 10% annual return, you earn $100. When you invest $100,000 at the same rate, you earn $10,000. Same behavior, same risk, same investment vehicle, but 100 times the absolute return. This is not a function of skill or knowledge. It's a function of scale. The system rewards capital itself, not just the decision to deploy it. This creates a structural divergence in how wealth accumulates. For someone starting with little capital, wealth building is almost entirely labor-driven. Every dollar saved comes from income, which comes from time spent working. Progress is slow because it's constrained by how many hours you can work and how much your labor is worth in the market. But as capital accumulates, a second income stream emerges, one that isn't constrained by time. Your investments generate returns while you sleep. The more capital you accumulate, the larger this passive income stream becomes, until eventually it can exceed your labor income entirely. This is why the first increment of savings feels disproportionately difficult compared to later increments. Early on, you're fighting against the friction of living expenses, unexpected costs, and the opportunity cost of not spending. You're building wealth entirely through labor, with no meaningful assistance from capital returns. But once you cross a certain threshold, let's call it the point where your capital base is large enough to generate noticeable returns, the dynamic shifts. Now you're building wealth through both labor and capital. Your effort hasn't changed, but the system is suddenly working in your favor instead of against you. The financial system also structures access to credit and investment opportunities in ways that favor existing capital. Interest rates on loans decrease as your credit worthiness increases, which is often a function of how much wealth you already have. Access to lower-fee investment products, better mortgage rates, and business capital all improve as your financial position strengthens. The system isn't neutral. It's designed to reduce costs and increase returns for those who already have resources. There's also a psychological infrastructure that reinforces this pattern. When you have limited capital, financial decisions are dominated by risk aversion. You can't afford to lose what little you have, so you avoid volatility, even when volatility might offer higher expected returns. But when you have a substantial capital base, you can tolerate more risk because a loss won't threaten your basic security. This means that identical investment opportunities are functionally different depending on your capital position. The person with more capital can access the same opportunity with less psychological cost, making it easier to capture returns that the person with less capital might rationally avoid. Outcome. Divergence. Consider two individuals who both commit to saving 15% of their income and investing it in the same index fund. Person A starts with no savings. Person B starts with $20,000 already invested. Both are disciplined. Both follow the same strategy. Both make the same behavioral choices. In the first year, Person A saves and invests a portion of their income and earns returns on that growing balance. Person B does the exact same thing, but also earns returns on the existing $20,000. By the end of the year, Person B has accumulated more wealth, not because they worked harder or made better decisions, but because they had more capital working on their behalf from the beginning. Over time, this gap widens. Person B reaches the next milestone faster, which means their capital base grows faster, which means their returns grow faster. The behavioral inputs are identical, but the structural outputs diverge. Person A is still doing everything right, but they're operating within a system that rewards existing capital more than incremental effort. This dynamic becomes even more pronounced across generations. Someone who inherits capital starts with the structural advantage already in place. They don't need to spend years building the initial base. They begin at the point where capital is already generating meaningful returns. Their labor income can be directed entirely toward lifestyle or additional investment rather than toward building the foundation. The system doesn't care how the capital was acquired. It simply rewards its presence. The same pattern appears in housing markets. Two households with identical incomes and savings rates will experience different wealth trajectories depending on when they were able to purchase property. The household that bought earlier benefits from appreciation and builds equity, which can be leveraged for additional investment. The household that bought later pays more for the same asset and builds equity more slowly. Both made the same decision, to buy a home, but the timing, which is often determined by initial capital availability, creates divergent outcomes. This isn't about individual failure or success. It's about how the system structures opportunity. Effort and discipline are necessary, but they're not sufficient to explain why some people build wealth quickly, while others build it slowly. The missing variable is the structural advantage that capital itself provides. Why this pattern persists. The behavioral narrative persists because it serves multiple functions. For individuals, it provides a sense of agency. Believing that wealth is purely a function of choices means you can control your outcome. This is psychologically preferable to believing that structural forces beyond your control play a significant role. The behavioral model is also simpler to communicate. It fits into clear advice. Save more, spend less, invest wisely. Structural explanations are more complex and less actionable, which makes them less appealing for popular consumption. there's also an ideological dimension. The behavioral model aligns with meritocratic narratives that are deeply embedded in economic discourse. If wealth reflects choices, then the distribution of wealth reflects the distribution of good decision-making. This framework justifies existing inequalities and discourages scrutiny of the structural rules that govern capital accumulation. Acknowledging that the system rewards existing capital more than effort would require confronting uncomfortable questions about fairness and design. Financial institutions also benefit from the behavioral framing. If wealth building is about individual choices, then the solution is better financial products and services, more apps, more advice, more investment options. This keeps the focus on consumption of financial services rather than on the structural rules that determine how capital compounds. The industry has little incentive to highlight that the primary determinant of wealth accumulation speed is how much capital you start with, because that insight doesn't translate into product sales. Finally, the people who benefit most from the current structure, those who already have capital, are also the people with the most influence over economic narratives. Their experience genuinely reflects the idea that wealth builds quickly once you have momentum. But they often attribute that momentum to their own decisions rather than to the structural advantage their capital provides. This creates a feedback loop where the behavioral narrative is reinforced by the people whose success is most visible. Rational interpretation. The core insight here is that financial systems are not neutral platforms where effort translates linearly into results. They are structures that amplify the productivity of existing capital. The more capital you have, the faster it grows, independent of how much effort you expend. This doesn't mean effort is irrelevant. It means effort operates within a framework that rewards capital accumulation in nonlinear ways. Understanding this changes how you interpret financial outcomes. When someone builds wealth quickly, it's not necessarily because they're more disciplined or smarter. It's often because they reached the threshold where capital itself began doing significant work. When someone struggles to build wealth despite consistent effort, it's not necessarily because they're making mistakes. It's because they're still in the phase where wealth accumulation is almost entirely labor-driven, with minimal assistance from capital returns. This framework also clarifies why certain financial milestones feel transformative. It's not just psychological, it's structural. Crossing the threshold where your capital generates meaningful returns changes the mechanics of wealth building. You're no longer fighting against the system's friction. You're beginning to benefit from its design. Closing reflection. The gap between effort and outcome in wealth building isn't a personal failing. It's a feature of how financial systems reward capital. Recognizing this doesn't change the math, but it does change the interpretation. Progress that feels slow isn't necessarily a sign you're doing something wrong. It's often a sign you're still building the foundation that will eventually allow the system to work in your favor. If you found this perspective useful, consider subscribing. We'll keep exploring how economic structures shape the outcomes we often attribute to individual choice.